Hello, everyone. Welcome to my show, Curryup Startup Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world class Asian entrepreneurs, C suite executives, leaders, and allies who provide insights and wisdom from their personal journey to inspire you. And this is your host, Priyanka Komala. And to our listeners, do subscribe to our podcast. We are on LinkedIn Live, we are on YouTube under the name Curryup Startup Podcast and all your favorite podcast streaming platforms. So check out all our episodes as well. Today, we have a very interesting guest who's joining us from Washington, D.C., here in the US, Shruti Rajagopalan. Hi, Shruti. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Priyanka. Thank you so much for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you on the show, Shruti. And to our listeners, we have a different spin to the show. Shruti is a well-known economist. She's a senior research fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University and a fellow at the Classical Liberal Institute at New York University School of Law. Before joining the Mercatus Center, she was an associate professor of economics at State University of New York, Burgess College. Shruti enjoys writing in popular press, and she has a fortnightly column called The Impartial Spectator in Mint. She also has published opinion editorials on Indian political economy in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, The Hindu, the Indian Express, and many more. Shruti's broad area of interest is the economic analysis of comparative legal and political systems. Shruti, that's an impressive portfolio of work. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. You're very kind.
Thank you, Shruti. And to our listeners, 3 reasons why you should be listening to this episode. 1, let's unveil the career journey of an economist. Let's unveil the career journey of an economist and the leadership lessons that Dr. Shruti can provide as an Asian, as a woman of color, because there are very few economists whom we can really look up to as role models, one being Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist at IMF. 2, let's delve into the economic analysis in the current COVID pandemic situation. And 3, as the host of Ideas of India podcast, let's unveil the podcaster behind Dr. Shruti as well. So we are super excited to learn more about you, Shruti, and feel inspired.
Oh, thank you. I hope I do some inspiring and actually live up to all the kind things you've said about me.
Thank you, Shruti. So let's start with your childhood. You grew up in Delhi, in the northern part of India. How was it growing up with the Delhi's hot summers?
I actually come from a Tamilian family, and we grew up in Delhi, as you mentioned. So, it was really interesting. I had no other point of comparison. It was growing up in Delhi, it was in the 80s and 90s, just very middle class family. But of course, with a lot of privilege, despite being middle class. My mother's a renowned classical musician, Saraswati Rajagopalan. She plays the veena. So, my upbringing had a lot of music. My father was a banker in the public sector banking system. Both sets of grandparents lived with us. So it was just, very, very typical childhood, but, mixed in with a lot of culture, music, travel, especially when we accompanied my mother across the world on her tours and things like that. So, a classic middle class upbringing, but with the privilege of having a very culturally cosmopolitan, added benefit in the family.
I love the way you put it, Shruti. Growing up in a normal family with career aspirations, and look at you today. And to our listeners, you need to look at the list of degrees that Shruti has under her belt. And I'm going to read it out. I'm just so proud of you as a fellow Indian, as an Asian, and a woman. She has a PhD in economics from George Mason University and a BA honors in economics and a law degree from the University of Delhi in India and an LLM from the European Masters in Law and Economics program at University of Hamburg, Ghent University, and the University of Bologna. So that's impressive. And when I asked Shruti, please be my guest on episode number 42, she had an interesting spin on that as well. So, talk a little bit about the importance of number 42 and your career journey as an economist. I hope we have the answers for everything.
Well, the first one is really easy. 42 in Douglas Adams is, 42 is the answer to everything. So the second you said I'm the guest for the 42nd episode, I said, well, that's it. We're going to solve all the troubles in the world, right? But I was just being facetious. About my journey economics, honestly, I grew up wanting to become a lawyer. I didn't know anything about the discipline of economics. It wasn't taught in schools or anything like that. The only childhood moment I remember, or had a big impact on me, which now I look back as an economist, is when India liberalized. And you grew up around the same time in India, so suddenly you can get Pepsi and you can get more than two brands of chocolates, and
Right.
there are
Like
these huge changes happening
all
in
the
society.
multinational brands show up in our country.
Exactly. All the brands show up. You can literally see the economic change, shaping around you. So that was, I think, one big event. But other than that, my childhood was very unremarkable, in forming an economist of any sort. I just wanted to be a lawyer. And towards that, I did my BA, and you have to choose a subject for your BA. I thought I would be good at economics. And, I mean, the way Delhi University works is your grades determine your college and your choice of subject. So I got great grades in my 12th grade exam, so I managed to get into a really good school, and I managed to get into the economics program. And I think it's really at Delhi University that my career as an economist shaped. I had an incredible set of professors, most notably Professor Anil Kukradi. He was my he taught me principles and intermediate microeconomics at Hansraj, and he was just exceptional. He recently retired. I'm still in touch with him. It's just like the kind of person who can just spark an economic interest in pretty much anyone, and he's always been a bit of a role model in that sense. I had a great professor in public finance called, Professor Alka Kakkar. So these are sort of the people who started the fire. I still went on to get a law degree at the University of Delhi. Very early into that, I knew that I did not want to become a lawyer. But, like typical Indian families, one doesn't drop out of a program. That's just not in our DNA, right? Like you finish what you started. So I tried to find things in law school that I found interesting. I mean, I did a lot of research and writing. I worked at a pro bono research center with Dr. Rajiv Dhawan and a bunch of other people. And the economic framework, the analytical framework of economics kept nagging at me the whole time. And that's when I started digging more into it. I met a few other professors. I learned that there was a whole area in economics called law and economics. Then I learned that there was a whole area in economics called constitutional economics. And I said, oh, this is amazing. That's what I really want to do. And then I went on to do my master's and PhD in that area. So the reason I have so many degrees is I didn't quite know what I was doing. It was a very long-winded path to, becoming what I eventually wanted to become. And most of the blame for the degrees is that, good Indian middle-class girls don't know when to quit.
Hey, Shruti, you have an impressive amount of education, and I'm so glad you're putting it into purpose by helping enlighten a lot of people about the fundamentals of economics. That's very important and crucial in today's times. And I'm so glad you're being very humble.
No, honestly, I mean, if I could have taken a shorter path to this career, I would have jumped at it. I was confused for a long time. And usually some people who are confused, to know when to quit and move on to, try a few other things. I didn't quite know that, I didn't know that you could drop out of school or, like those were just not options given my upbringing. And you can imagine that, right? Like, well-educated, good girls in India don't just drop out of school. So
Right.
I was being, I was just partly joking, but honestly, sometimes, you start something and it's not for you. And I think we need to have, especially among Asians and Asian Americans, the attitude of it is okay to fail at something and then go try something else. You're not a failure if you drop out of, law school or something like that. I could have saved myself a few years of my life.
That's a good attitude to have. And that's one of the reasons we have this podcast, because we can spotlight such inspiring stories on. You get to choose the path that you want to be on. And it doesn't have to be a linear path sometimes. It could be a long-winded path like what you chose. But towards the end of the day, there's a meaning and purpose from the experiences
Yeah.
that you draw as part of the journey.
Yeah, no, I got very lucky. I had some fantastic teachers, within the field of economics. I had some incredible mentors, and who continue to be my teachers and mentors till day. And I was very fortunate in that sense that even in a somewhat niche area within economics, I managed to find my people and get the support and the guidance that I needed to eventually become, an economist.
That's pretty cool. So let's talk about your recent articles. You write
Ah,
as the impartial spectator of Mint, which is a well-known news outlet in India. Uh, you spoke about, you wrote about, I should say, getting Indians vaccinated amidst COVID, and I felt that was a very interesting piece, given the population that we have. And you focused on we need both a government subsidy and a free market for vaccines to fight the COVID pandemic. Tell us your take about the ongoing situation and some of the thoughts that are still prevailing in your mind.
Yeah, so since I wrote that column, some things have changed in India. So when I wrote that column, the assumption was that the vaccine will be one dose per person. So that assumption is now changed. It seems like it'll be given in 3 doses, right? Which obviously increases the cost. So some of the numbers in that column literally just they need to be tripled. For that reason, I think I'd said 11,000 crore rupees, which is about 110 billion rupees. That's about 1.5 billion USD. So now you think in terms of 4.5 billion USD. My argument there was that even with the modern number, which is Adar Punawala gave this number. He said it's going to take 80,000 crore rupees, 800 billion, right, to vaccinate all Indians across the 2 or 3 doses. That's only $11 billion. That is actually not that much money when it comes to thinking about the pandemic. The pandemic has had two kinds of, impact on the economy or like economic disruption. One is the pandemic led to many governments, the most restrictive one in India, to impose lockdowns. Right. So the lockdown just kind of kills all economic activity. So the COVID related pandemic led to the lockdown and therefore, economic activity was disrupted. But even in places where there wasn't such a severe lockdown, economic activity has been disrupted. And the reason is people are scared to go out, right? People are not going to restaurants. No one is going to, hear a concert or go to sports bars and things like that.
And the local economy takes a very hard hit.
Exactly. So the local economy is, of course, taken a hard hit, but the economy is like a, meticulously interconnected sort of web, right? So, we see it in our local context the most because we literally see, retail stores and restaurants boarded up. But actually, the global economy has also taken a hit. So in that sense, for India, which is a fairly large economy, right? 3 trillion economy, $11 billion is pocket change to kickstart the economy and make sure this problem goes away, right? So that's just the question of, is the benefit of paying for a vaccine as a society worth the cost? And I'm like, it is absolutely worth the cost. This 11 billion will pay for itself in spades. You can make sure that it will generate economic activity and that will generate government revenue. So even the government will get paid back should it subsidize this. Now, there are 3 issues at work when it comes to how do we actually make this happen? Like, let's assume we magically produce, the amount of money, which is this 80,000 crore rupees that is required. The most crucial insight that economics gives us is that vaccines are a net positive externality. And what we mean by that is that each one of us associates a private value for the vaccine, right? So, it's going to allow me to go to work. It's going to allow me to go to a, sports game, or it's going to allow me to go to a concert. And so we have a private value associated with it. But the moment I vaccinate myself, I'm not just protecting myself, I also protect other people. Right. So all these vaccines, for most of these diseases, and especially for COVID, the social value of the vaccine is always greater than the private value of the vaccine. Right. So in economics, the models would suggest that, because the private value is less than the social value, it's probably going to be underconsumed. So the government must subsidize it. This is true for any positive externality. Now, there are a few things in addition to that for COVID, especially in India. Now that we know the social value is so high, how do we pay for it and who will pay for it, right? Now, India, in addition to having a very large number of people, also has a very large number of poor people, right? And we know that the economic disruption has hurt the poor the most, especially the poor who are in the informal sector. So my argument is that the government must pay for the poor people, right? But at the same time, we can have a market, a free market price for people who can afford it. right? So what will end up happening if we put in price controls or quantity controls is the people who are well connected end up getting it first. And you've grown up in India, I've grown up in India, we know how this works. The advantage of having this dual system where the government will reimburse at cost for poor people, and then pharmaceutical sellers can sell it at market price for rich people, is that people who can afford it will pay for it. They will likely pay for it for their household help or people who work with them or for them. There are going to be a lot of people in civil society who immediately get into action and start helping get people vaccinated at market price. There are going to be institutions who will pay for it for their employees, and so on and so forth. So there is a large group within Indian society that can afford to pay for this at market price. For the rest of the people, the government should reimburse the pharmaceutical company at cost, which is about $3 per dose. That's roughly the cost of it, right? And here, there are multiple models you can have. So you can have a system where, you have a whole number of private vaccine delivery systems where the government will reimburse the private vendor for each dose that is administered. Or the government, like the polio drive, can set up its own vaccination drive, which obviously takes much longer. So there are multiple models, but my argument is still that the government should pay for those who cannot pay for themselves, but not intervene in the market process, right? And finally, we really shouldn't nationalize or appropriate the vaccines, because this is a tendency in India. There are already a lot of people who are very upset that, vaccine manufacturers are going to make 80,000 crores. But frankly, I mean, resources went into producing the vaccine. 80,000 crores is what it costs to produce that at cost, not making huge profit margins, right? And it's very important that we pay for this, right? And not expropriate or nationalize from the vaccine industry, because otherwise we will kill the industry. And it's very important India supplies vaccines not just to the largest population, the youngest population in the world, which is Indians, but also to the world. So there are multiple reasons we need to get the economic problem right, not just the technological or the scientific problem right.
That's a very interesting spin, Shruti. In terms of the social value of getting vaccinated is more than the private value. I think that's a very interesting takeaway from an economic perspective, because most of the times you're looking at from a health perspective or a societal perspective, but really understanding the crux of economics has really opened our minds in terms of how do you look at a global pandemic like COVID.
Yeah, but a 50-cent mask, the social value of that is greater than the private value. Because when I wear a mask, I don't just protect myself, I also protect everyone within a few
Right.
feet of me, right? So it's not just true for vaccines, but it is particularly true for vaccines because the effect is more durable.
That's pretty great. Thank you so much for sharing that interesting piece of insight and the economic models and the analysis. It gives us a nice opening into the minds of an economist, which is a totally different perspective than our regular way of looking at a pandemic. Now, there's another interesting article that I wanted to touch base on, which is about lowering the entry barriers to radio and television broadcasting, and that could fill gaps in schooling at a very low cost. Tell us your take on this, given we have the online schools, especially with this global pandemic, but there's also the affordability of parents in terms of technology all of a sudden for these kids, and kids adopting these technologies as well. So what's your take on that from an economic perspective?
Yeah, so this has been, I think, the worst disruption, aside from the economic that has been caused by COVID, is that children are not going to school, right? And here there are two aspects to it. One is, of course, the child development, both social and educational, in terms of human capital, gets stunted. But the other impact this has is it's going to really increase the inequality that education is fundamentally supposed to bridge. So what is happening in India and many other parts of the world is families where, parents have college degrees or parents are educated and parents have access, infrastructure, they have data plans, they can afford tablets for their children. They are coping just fine. Aside from the psychological cost, they are able to seamlessly go online. And parents who are not technologically sophisticated or who are not literate or who don't have college degrees, who can't help their children with schoolwork, who can't afford, personalized tablets and laptops, their children get left behind, right? And normally this gap between the rich and the poor, this inequality gets bridged by education and schooling. And now we are seeing during the pandemic that this is just going to get worsened, right? So that's the fundamental thing that I want to put out there. Now, In India, we talk about, cell phone penetration, and it's true, we have fantastic cell phone penetration post liberalization, all the regulatory changes that were made in telecom, as well as, the introduction of internet and data, and, the big, very, very cheap data plans. But not every household has multiple devices, right? And when we talk about household penetration, usually it's one of the parents who will have a sophisticated phone with a good data plan that they likely take with them to work, right? Or if they're working from home, they need it to work from home. It's not dedicated to the child for their education. This is, of course, the worst affected are the poorest students. So we have about 100 to 150 million students who are just completely off grid. Okay, just totally and completely off grid. There is about another 150 million students who are somewhat off grid. There is someone in the household who might have a device, but they. The reason I wrote this column was a 14-year-old Dalit student, a young girl in Kerala, committed suicide because she didn't have the devices to do online schooling. Now, India, on the other hand, has very high television penetration, and as we know, the television stays in the household. It doesn't leave with the parent, right? It's not used for work. So if we could manage to use the television as somewhat of a substitute and broadcast education, that would have been great. Now, some of the state governments, like Kerala state government, some of the state governments started doing that. But I started thinking about, why is it that we don't have really good educational channels on an ongoing basis? Why is the television, which is so universal in India right now, not being used properly to impart education? Why is it just soaps and, bad Saas Bahu shows and, Bollywood?
Right. And it's a
And
perfect channel, right?
it's a great
Where
channel.
there's mass consumption. And,
Yeah.
as kids, we were hooked to our television sets as we were growing
Exactly.
up.
And you can have lots of different ways of communicating. You can do it in regional language. And I figured that, as always, the reason is regulatory, right? So the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting has entry requirements for anyone who wants to start a television channel. So for a person who wants to start a TV channel, it's 5 crore, 50 million rupees, or which is close to about 680 $700 million, right? And for companies that are applying for a news channel, it is 20 crore, 200 million rupees, right? Which is about 2.7, $2.8 million. That's very high cost of entry to start a new channel. 20 crores to start an education channel, you're never going to recover the money, right? Or a niche news channel, or to start a history channel. So what we end up seeing in India, because of bad licensing and entry barrier requirements, you only see people catering to the largest number of people and chasing ratings. So if you've been following the news in India, this is not just about education and broadcasting, it's also overall about news. Like, our TV channels are making money off of the unfortunate death by suicide of Sushant Singh Rajput, or they're chasing, like, alleged drug scandals in Bollywood, instead of actually reporting on important things. And the reason for this kind of sensationalism, or is because only the loudest, most sensational channel can actually raise the revenues to pay for this 20 crore licensing fee which was required to enter the business. So the entry licensing has completely killed diversity in programming in India. And my argument is, we need to eliminate this licensing. Now, the government says that will mean there's proliferation of channels. And I'm like, that's exactly what we need. We need proliferation of channels, right? Some of them are going to be bad, some of them are going to be good, but that's fine.
Right. And they're going to self-select themselves, right?
They're
With the
going to self-select
viewership.
themselves, and
Right.
some of them are going to be very niche, but that's amazing, right? So imagine if you could do, like, even something like entrance exams for IIT JEE. If some kind person who was genuinely interested in it for philanthropic reasons, not just earning tuition money, was interested in imparting this kind of information to kids on how they can crack the entrance exams, or how they can do better in their 10th and 12th grade exams. I think those kinds of channels would be great, and it would also improve basic, literacy and arithmetics. So I think there's a huge opportunity there. It's being completely stifled by bad regulation, and that was sort of the argument I made. So it starts with a COVID-specific issue, but I think it's a much broader issue in Indian political economy.
That's a very interesting spin again on how broadcast media works in India. And I'm so glad you helped us understand how the regulation system works. And I agree with you. When there are issues about brutal women rapes and killings in the northern part of India, or be it the farmer situations and the bills that are getting passed, which are not farmer friendly, media is looking for sensationalization of Bollywood issues or things that bring them TRP ratings. And that's a sad situation of the state of media.
Yeah, and I think it's, I mean, we are, the government says that they want to do this to, ensure there's quality and non-proliferation of channels. I think it's also an instrument of control. The moment you have very high entry requirements and you have this kind of licensing regime, you can control what kind of information is put out in mass media. So of course there are other, venues. We have Twitter, we have YouTube, we have the kinds of things you're doing, the kinds of things I'm doing, but they're not mass, right? And they're not in every person's household. They've done the same thing with radio licensing, by the way. That's why podcasts are so big in India, but you don't have all radio channels in India are only playing Bollywood or devotional music, right? Because you need to, again, appeal to
Gather
the
the
largest number
wider
of people.
audiences.
Yeah. So
Right.
the amounts I mentioned for television, they're smaller for radio, but it's the same mess, But then the podcasters like you and me get to have a career.
you know, uh, I think it's important for our community, our people, to actually be aware of how things work behind the scenes and choose the medium to help grow and educate themselves and be informed as to what's more important. And I see a lot of proliferation on social media. The youngsters, millennial generation, are focused on empowerment specific issues. When they see racial injustice, people speak up. I think the change is happening, but it's like, how does the government align to make sure the citizens, get a free path in terms of voicing their opinions and ensuring the government regulations and the policies reflect the changing times as well?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, in India, we've always stifled free speech, right? Some of it is through these regulatory requirements. Some of them are just through, bad laws we have, like contempt of court and, things like that. We have all these public decency, morality, all these additional issues. We censor our movies, we censor our television, we even censor ads on TV. So I think, I mean, the free speech standard that you're talking about, which, the global standard and especially the American standard, we just simply don't have that in India. So whatever is happening under the radar. And the moment it becomes too big, the government just clamps down on it.
Very true. Hey, but you also have an amazing writing career where you voice your opinions as part of free speech. Tell us about how does it feel writing as an impartial spectator for Mint?
So, Mint has been great. I have been writing for Mint pretty much since the first week that they were in existence. The opinion editors, page editor at that time was Niranjan Rajadhyaksh, who was just an incredible editor, great mentor to young people who were writing, literally held my hand and said, hey, you have a couple of nice ideas you should write. And so that's kind of how I started. I started writing the occasional piece for them. About 3 years ago, he said that I think you should really start writing a column. You have a lot of ideas. You should get into the discipline. I was terrified to write one because I was like, how will I come up with something every 2 weeks? And then, exactly as Niranjan had predicted, the moment you put your mind to this, there's so much going on around us that it just happens. So Mint has been a wonderful home for me. You mentioned the name Impartial Spectator. That is actually a theme that comes, from Adam Smith. Adam Smith's book, The Theory of Moral Sentiments. For him, the impartial spectator is an imaginary figure or construct that each one of us has to offer moral guidance, to evaluate one's own conduct and sentiments as we negotiate our lives. Many people at Mint liked it because they thought that it may also convey a non-partisan element, which, I mean, as an economist, of course, my uh, uh, responsibility is always to get the economic ideas right and not, who's in power and which party is ruling and things like that. But it worked both ways. I was writing an economics column, so I borrowed from Adam Smith. And it's been a wonderful run. It has really made me think. I mean, I have thought a lot deeper about things, like why is a 14-year-old girl in Kerala committing suicide? Because COVID doesn't allow her to go to school. And then I go down the rabbit hole and start looking into why this is happening or not happening. So it's also like really helped me think much more about, ideas that I would have normally just dismissed. I would have just read this in the paper and felt bad and moved on. It's just, now I know that if something is annoying me or it's on my mind, I should really write about it. And it's been a great run. I mean, it's a great privilege for anybody to get a column, and Mint has just been a wonderful home for me.
Kudos, and your articles are amazing. So I'd encourage our listeners to check out the Impartial Spectator at
Thank
Mint.
you. You're too kind.
And we'll have a link to it as part of our episode notes as well. Now, tell us about your Ideas of India podcast. Why should people listen to it?
So it actually relates to something we've been talking about. My goal with the podcast was to bridge the gap between academic ideas and, ideas in real world problems and policy. And in India, I mean, we just talked about this, the current discourse on the news, on the radio, sometimes even the newspapers is very disappointing. It lacks depth. And it is not rooted in the latest research or data or, the kind of knowledge that is being produced. So the advantage of having academics or working within the academy is that it's very well researched and rigorous. But the disadvantage is it's usually not easily accessible, right, to public intellectuals or even, really engaged lay citizens. So my goal with the podcast was to bridge this gap. So I have an incredible list of experts and academics who've written amazing books and papers. So, I've had economists like Shreya Iyer, who works on religion, Ajay Shah, who's written about state capacity. I've had historians like Dinyar Patel, who's written this amazing biography of Dadabhai Naoroji. I've had legal anthropologist Anuj Bhuvania on the Indian Supreme Court, political theorist Madhav Khosla, who's spoken about, the founding of India's constitution. My next episode is actually, I'm really excited, is with Viral Acharya, who's a professor of finance at NYU. And as you know, he was the deputy governor of RBI until last year. And, we're talking about the problems with the autonomy of the central banks, which is caused by government fiscal dominance. So it's just like an incredible list of people. There's so much to learn from them. And I'm hoping, that I can bring their ideas to a broader audience. It's also a slightly self-serving exercise. In the process, I get to read great books. I mean, you know this as a podcaster. When you're doing something with a particular podcast in mind, you research it a little bit more deeply. So when I read their books, I read it in a more engaged and deeper fashion. I don't read it passively. So it's been a great personal exercise for me. I've been learning so many new ideas. It's an absolute privilege to speak to them. And hopefully, the goal long term is that it changes the discourse, one episode at a time.
That's a pretty cool idea, and I love the name Ideas of India podcast. It aligns with your thinking as well in terms of connecting the field of economics, the scientific research behind it, with lay audiences as well, so we can really understand the approach behind it.
Yeah, no, that's very much the goal.
Now let's talk about the importance of role models and mentors. We discussed offline about how we wish we had more role models when we were growing up, right, as we chose our career paths. Today we have Geeta Gopinath, who's the Indian American economist who's been named as the chief economist of the International Monetary Fund since 2019. As an Asian, as a woman of color who comes from humble background, it's very inspiring when you see women like her rise to the top and literally make her word change policy decisions, impact the stock market. So it's huge having somebody like her. Now tell us about your one advice that you would give for any women as an Asian woman of color who wants to rise into leadership roles like you and Geeta Gopinath.
Oh, wow. I can't speak for Geeta Gopinath. She's just an incredible person. For me, it's a little bit hard to say when it comes to, an Asian woman of color. I'll tell you why. I grew up with an enormous amount of privilege from where I come from, right? Because in India, if you come from an upper caste or especially a Tamilian Brahmin family, you are not really you're not facing disadvantages that minorities usually face. It's an incredibly privileged background. I mean, there was no question on whether I would go to school, whether I would go to university. I didn't even imagine dropping out of law school. I mean, my family, culturally, educationally, was just incredibly supportive. So I can't speak to them as the in terms of experience of having disadvantage in any way. I must address that, right away. But more generally, the kind of advice I would give to young women is, I think I would just say, don't lose your femininity and your culture, in the sense that I have occupied a very male space most of my career because economics is dominated by men. Not just, whether this is in India or the United States, it's a very, the male female ratio is a little bit off. And I have seen women, and I'm sure I have done the same. We all try and conform to what an economist should look like and sound like and behave like, and it tends to be very male, right? So, the most general advice I would give is, be yourself, embrace, whatever is your conception of being feminine, embrace whatever is your conception of your cultural context, whether it is in the way you dress or what you eat or, whom you date or whatever it is. So that's my general advice. The other advice I have is, I think it's a great thing to cultivate good, strong relationships with mentors, right? And this is not just with women, it's anyone who within your particular world or field would be a good mentor for you. I think my life has been shaped by incredible teachers and mentors who mentor me till date, no matter how small or big the problem. And I have hugely benefited from that. And I think cultivating those relationships over a very long period of time, I think it just makes one a stronger person with more dimension.
That's pretty great advice. And role models and mentors play a great part in shaping our life. I really agree with that part of it. And you mentioned you've occupied definitely a male-dominated space. We see that with, even in the field of technology, we always say it's women in technology because we're trying to create more allies with men and, leaders who can give us that, that room to really grow and nurture our ambitions, our passions.
I would actually just add one more thing. I've grown up in a very male dominated space, but on the other hand, all my mentors have also been men.
That's really impressive.
Yeah, no, but I have had incredible male role models who have really understood, my point of view, whether it is work related or personal. And one advantage of also being in a male dominated space is you get to find all the successful people are men, and then they also teach you how to navigate that space, despite being a smaller proportion, of that population within economists or within technology or whatever it may be. So I think even more so that, for me, it's really the male mentors who have shaped me and my career.
That's pretty good to know. And, men are important allies for us, right from, our fathers to our, to our partners, to our friends and professors. They play a great role in shaping our lives and giving us the strength and inspiration as well to make an impact, make change. And it comes only when there is a supportive, cohesive community around you, especially men.
Yeah, absolutely. I really lucked out. A huge part of it is the birth lottery, which is, great parents, grandparents, grandfathers and my father. I chose well with my husband, who's incredibly supportive. I think might be even more of a feminist than I am. And
that's a good thing to have.
yeah, and my father-in-law, I'm sort of surrounded by very really vocal and passionate feminist men. And the same is true for all my teachers and co-authors and things like that. So I think, there's such a huge element of luck in this. I always feel nervous advising young women because I have honestly not had those terrible experiences that we hear from women, Asian women, women of color. I just had like this, sort of rosy, privileged life in comparison. So I must acknowledge that.
That's so humble of you to share those, your upbringing, which has helped you in your path. But at the same time, I love the fact that you're willing to support other women, other people in the community who can, engage with each other and, see you as a role model as well. In spite of whatever path you choose, there's always a way to rise to the top. With that being said, we have a fun rapid fire round for you. Are you ready for that?
I hope I'm ready for that.
You tell me the first thing that comes to your mind, and it needs to be one word. Okay. Role model.
Probably James M. Buchanan, the Nobel laureate James M. Buchanan, who started the field of constitutional political economy. He's incredible. He's the reason I came to George Mason University among some of the many other scholars who were here. He had this incredible career. He wrote from, say, I think his earliest papers are 1949 until 2013 when he died, and some of it was even published posthumously. So he wrote for 65 years as an academic, right? And he was just throughout these 6-7 decades trying to understand the kinds of rules and institutional and constitutional structures that lead to a free and prosperous society. So I can't he's literally the first thing that pops to my head.
I see you're super excited sharing about your role model as well. What does happiness mean to you in one word?
Oh, just being home. I like being home with my family, my dog, with left alone with a book and some music. I like having my family around, but not necessarily talking to them all the time. And we all family of readers, so we just like to read. Yeah, that's probably my idea of happiness.
What is one fun thing about you that you can share exclusively with our Curryup Startup listeners?
A fun thing. Actually, I'm a lot more silly than people imagine. Everyone, like you mentioned, everyone thinks I'm like a serious economist who writes about all these really serious topics, and I have this impartial spectator column. I'm actually really silly. I laugh at the silliest things. I crack myself up all the time over the dumbest jokes. I could watch like Tom and Jerry and Laurel and Hardy over and over again. So I'm actually a lot more silly than I get credit for.
It's nice to have, that kind of a personality as well, where you're witty and humorous, which we can see as part of the show as well. Being more approachable, I think that's a very crucial quality for economists. The last question we have, what is your native language? And I know the answer for that. And one word to describe yourself in it.
Oh boy, I don't know what my native language is. I learned English and Hindi and Tamil all simultaneously, and it's a mix in my head depending on what topic I'm talking about. I think in a particular language. So if I'm talking about work, it's English. If I'm talking about food, it's Tamil, or I'm talking about family.
Why don't we do Tamil? What's one word you would describe yourself in Tamil?
Curious. So in Tamil, that would be avaramak. Or in Hindi, that would be jigyasu. Not curious like odd curious, like curious like want to learn more about the world curious. So, so jigyasu would, be I think that good translation. Someone's going to catch this on the internet, right? If this is a good translation. Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Do you have any parting thoughts and your experience being on the show that you can share with our listeners?
Oh, thank you. This is, you've been so kind to invite me. It's been lovely doing this. I told you this a little bit before we went live, but I think it's really great to have people who have had all sorts of different careers, especially for Asians, because Asian families of privilege have a very cookie cutter version of what success looks like, right? Like it doesn't include doing strange things or dropping out of school and, becoming like a law and economics person or something like that. And so to that extent, I think the more interesting experiences you can highlight through your podcast, it's really great for younger people. I wish I had a show like this when I was growing up, and I had known that there's, various different fields within economics. It's not just macro and monetary and labor and development. So to that extent, it's wonderful what you're doing. And thank you so much for having me. This was great fun.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan. So that was Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan, economist and, a wonderful podcaster, I should say, and a columnist as well. So thank you so much for joining our show. And to our listeners on Curryup Startup Podcast with Dr. Shruti Rajagopalan, the 3 key takeaways that we have. 1, you don't have to follow a linear path. Choose your passion and you'll figure your destination as you come along. And 2, we spoke about the situation in India from an economic analysis perspective, be it with the COVID vaccines and lowering the barrier for broadcast and radio and the TV medium in order to ensure kids deserve the education that they deserve, and we help these young minds afford this education, especially in this global pandemic. So that was very interesting analysis, and I love the fact that the social value of using vaccines trumps the private value. I think that's a good takeaway for us. And 3rd, and the most fabulous aspect of all, embrace yourself, be it your style, your culture, your femininity, no matter the space that you operate within. Just be yourself. So those are the 3 key takeaways. With that, super excited to have had you on our show, and we look forward to following you on your Twitter channel as well, which is very impressive, the kind of nuggets that you share with us. So listeners, do check that out. And until another interesting episode with another interesting guest, this is your host, Priyanka Komala, signing off from Curryup Startup Podcast, a podcast to spotlight world-class Asian leaders, entrepreneurs, and allies who provides insights and wisdom from their personal journey to inspire you. And make sure you subscribe to our channel on YouTube. We're on LinkedIn Live as well, and your favorite podcast streaming platforms. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.